Hello again everyone, welcome back to the channel, and to a brand new series that I'm starting about what the Romans introduced to Britain. Because they didn't just introduce armies and administration, they also introduced a lot of other things. And we're going to start with animals and plants. Before the Romans showed up, the Celtic tribes farmed things like wheat and barley. They kept cattle, sheep, pigs, and they foraged for fruit and herbs. But with the arrival of the Romans, things became a little more diverse, more systematic, and more Mediterranean. The Romans brought with them an entire toolkit of farming knowledge, including crop rotation, irrigation, and new tools, and a new range of crops and livestock completely new to the island. Let's start with the kitchen garden. Now, vegetables like garlic, onions, leeks, and cabbages were not native to Britain, or at least not widely grown, but they were a staple of a Roman diet. And archaeological finds in Silchester and London have shown that they became increasingly popular after the Roman conquest. Garlic, for example, was and still is a key seasoning, and leeks and onions, they would make their way into soups, stews and sauces, often being thickened with lentils or broad beans. Turnips and parsnips were cultivated more intensely under Roman rule, and carrots were grown too, but Roman carrots were more white or purple, not the orange ones that we have today. Even celery, once prized for its medicinal use rather than its taste, was introduced and grown in villa gardens. Fruit was another Roman favourite. Before the Romans turned up, wild crab apples were already growing in Britain, but when the Romans did turn up, they introduced new types of apple, along with plums, cherries, peaches, medlars, and possibly apricots. Cherries were likely brought in from the eastern Mediterranean, whilst peaches, being native to places like China and Persia, were a real luxury, struggling to grow in the dampness of Britain. But seeds and pits found in places like Colchester and London suggest that they did give it a good try. And yes, the Romans did attempt to grow grapes, although most wine was imported from Gaul or Hispania, but there's evidence of small-scale winemaking in southern Britain, with finds of amphorae at Fishbourne showing that wine was an important part of Roman culture, if you could afford it. The Romans also brought with them a lot of herbs, such as rosemary, coriander, dill, mint and lovage, that were used not only in food, but also for medicinal use or in rituals. Now on to animals. Now, chickens were probably here before the Roman conquest, but the Romans made them truly common, using them for their eggs, their meats, and sometimes even for fighting. The Romans even introduced domestic ducks, using them for eggs, meat and for feathers. And some people have suggested that even guinea fowl were introduced by the Romans, though the evidence for that is scarce. And what about cats? Well, cats were likely introduced, or at the very least popularised, by the Romans. They appear on Roman mosaics and were prized for their ability to catch rats and mice, especially in granaries. Vindolanda and London have turned up remains of domestic cats, so if you're a cat lover, you have the Romans to thank for that. The Romans also relied heavily on donkeys and mules for logistics of running the empire, for farming, trade and military logistics. Now, although there were ponies and oxen already in Britain, Roman pack animals increased efficiency. Now here's where things get a little bit fuzzy. For a long time it was assumed that rabbits were brought in by the Romans, but evidence is actually quite thin. One rabbit bone was found in Norfolk that was dated to the Roman period, but it's likely that this wasn't a breeding population. Most scholars now agree that rabbits didn't really take a foothold in Britain until the medieval period, introduced by the Normans, but it's possible that the Romans brought in one or two as exotic pets or curiosities. Fallow deer are another interesting example, as DNA and bone evidence suggests that the Romans brought them into Britain for elite hunting estates, but they didn't become prominent in Britain until the Normans reintroduced them centuries later. The Roman conquest of Britain didn't just bring us roads and forts and ruins, they transformed the landscape. They introduced dozens of new plants and animals that we take so much for granted now that we don't realise that they were originally foreign. From apples to herbs, from cats to chickens, these introductions were not just practical, they were cultural, connecting Britain to the wider Mediterranean world, shaping how people farmed, ate and lived. So the next time that you have rosemary on your roast chicken or you see a cat napping on a wall, remember, you are experiencing history. You are experiencing Roman Britain's legacy. But thank you very much for watching. There's only so much I can talk about in such a small amount of time, but I hope you've enjoyed. And please remember to like, comment and subscribe, it helps immensely, and I'll see you on the next one. Ciao for now.